Welcome to the Expanding Worlds podcast. I'm your host, Deborah Caldo. And welcome to another episode in this series on technology changing the future. When I started this series, I was really thinking more about the end result of technology, of the impact technology would have, hence the name of the series. So things like smart home tech and how that might be used to enhance people's lives and enable greater independence and dignity, as well as use of technology at work to support employability and things like that. But like many things, when you start looking at something properly, you find out how much you don't know. And that's where this episode comes in, where I'm talking to Jane Seale about digital inclusion. Jane has been researching in this area for some time, so provides us with an understanding of the history of the area, but also brings with her real insights into what is good practice, and as she politely puts it, less helpful practice. And 4 areas that she identifies that make digital inclusion really work: access, use, empowerment, and participation, I believe will get us all thinking about how we can help digital inclusion become the norm. And the other thing that resonated with me in my conversation with Jane was the idea that it comes back to attitude. It's true that when we change attitudes, we change actions. And I hope this episode will contribute to changing both. But enough from me, let's hear from Jane. Thank you very much, Jane, for speaking to me today. Can I start by asking you to tell me a little bit about your background and how you got into the area that you're now involved in?
Yeah, I was thinking about this. It was totally by accident, as happens with lots of people in this field. So back in 1983-84, I was studying for a psychology degree down at Plymouth University, and I had to do a dissertation and didn't really know what to do. And so one of my tutors suggested that I work with them. They were studying how BBC computers were being used in an adult day service for people with learning disabilities. And back in the 80s, what researchers were fixated with was proving that computers were better than teachers. So the study was actually comparing a computerized task with a non-computerized task to see if the computer would do any better in terms of supporting learning. And surprise, surprise, it didn't. But it got me hooked. So I then went up to Keele University to study for a PhD, again looking at the use of computers with adults with learning disabilities. So I was trying to understand how a hospital or a service was managed and supported and operated so that computers were being used effectively and for a benefit for people with learning disabilities. And I was working in what was called an applied research unit. And so one of the ways that the unit earned money was consultancy work. So one of the things I did on top of doing the kind of PhD research was to go around to hospitals, etc., training staff how to use computers, understanding the technical aspects so that they were confident, but also understanding the very different things they could do. And then, as happens when people finish their PhD, they look around scrambling for a job. So I just happened by sheer luck, found a job to apply for down at Southampton University with an occupational therapy and physiotherapy school. And occupational therapy in particular was one of those allied health professions that was starting to use computers with their patients, including adults with learning disabilities. So we're into the kind of 2000s now, and you might remember that the internet was becoming a thing. And so I was one of the first researchers to really research how people with learning disabilities were using the internet. Now, this was before Facebook. It was things like MySpace and Yahoo and things like that would offer people the chance to set up their own home pages. And I was really interested to see if people with learning disabilities were using them. So I did a study and I did find some use. But what really intrigued me was how these pages differed in voice. So a lot of the time, the pages would be written in the third person. So, like Jane uses technology too, rather than I use technology. And after doing a bit more examination, it became clear that quite a lot of support workers, parents, siblings, carers, were actually creating the home pages on behalf of the person they were supporting. And that really got me thinking, because on the one hand, it was quite innovative and supportive, but I was concerned might be the wrong word, but I was intrigued by, well, if they're supporting someone to use the internet, why the third voice? Why this distancing from the audience, from the readership? And one of the hypotheses I came up with was around protection, just wondering if parents and others were creating some kind of distance because they were worried about internet trolling and internet abuse. And I certainly found some examples of that. So some parents posting up that they'd closed down the homepage because of abuse. So I spent the next decade or so really trying to understand, well, what makes good supportive practice in terms of technology use so that supporters are helping their clients or patients or siblings or children to benefit from technology, particularly the internet, while also taking into account those kind of risk factors.
So that leads us really into how I found you, I guess, in the sense that I found you on the SeeAbility website. So can you talk a little bit about that project?
Yeah, that project emanated from pandemic in 2020. So you'll remember that in early 2020, we were all in lockdown, all at home, and for a long time not allowed to go out, not allowed to see family, etc., etc. And that got me and others really concerned about people with learning disabilities. How were they being supported in terms of their mental health, in terms of their well-being, and in terms of their access to information about COVID, if they were at home on their own. So I got some funding from my university, the Open University, to do a study to explore just that. How were adults with learning disabilities being supported to use technology during the pandemic? And it was a two-stage, two-pronged study. So the first part was an online survey asking people to tell me how they were supporting people with learning disabilities and what the issues were. And then asking people to volunteer to be interviewed for a longer in-depth kind of chat about their support practices. The people I were interviewing were parents, they were siblings, they were college lecturers. Some of them were self-advocacy groups, so people with learning disabilities themselves who were associated with groups like People First. Some of them were day services, and some of them were health and social care workers. All of these people were trying to provide support at a distance. So they had a person with a learning disability at home on their own in lockdown, not being able to go around to the house or anything. They were trying to figure out how to help that person access technology and use it, particularly use it to stay in touch with friends and family. That's what people were missing the most. It'll be no surprise to you that the majority of the support was around helping people get onto Zoom. Zoom was the real revelation that has really, in one sense, revolutionised technology access for people with learning disabilities. So talking to these support workers, including parents, and it was just awe-inspiring what they'd done. Examples of perfect support practice in a way. Really creative, thinking outside the box, resilient in terms of, well, if it doesn't work first time, we've just got to keep trying, just got to keep going, we have to, but evolving. So part of that resilience was learning from mistakes and developing all the time. So this pandemic, as horrible as it was, just kind of really opened people's eyes to what was possible if you really, really tried. The other thing that people were telling me in the interviews was when they were trying to contact people at home, they were coming across barriers. So some of these people at home were with parents or sometimes were in residential care with support workers. And some of the time, not all of the time, but some of the time, those parents and support workers were putting barriers in the way. And those barriers were varied. Sometimes it was saying, look, I can't help Johnny to access Zoom because I don't have the digital skills. Sometimes it was fear and anxiety and maybe just not knowing, a lack of awareness. It was, oh yeah, Johnny doesn't need to be on the internet. And sometimes it was, particularly in residential care homes, they just didn't have the capacity, the staffing to really provide the support. So that got me thinking around, well, I've seen and heard stories of really good practice, and I'm seeing and hearing stories of, I don't want to call it bad practice, but less helpful practice. And so after that study, I was taking the opportunity to really disseminate the findings. And I happened to do a seminar for Learning Disability England. And on this Zoom call where I was sharing my findings was a lady called Veronica Malenga, who was a digital inclusion officer at SeeAbility. And so Veronica had a responsibility for thinking around the role of technology, and she wanted to build capacity of her staff within SeeAbility. And so when she heard my talk, when I was talking about characteristics of helpful support and characteristics of unhelpful support, she contacted me, and you know what it's like. You have the equivalent of a cup of coffee over Zoom, and oh yeah, we can do that. And I just had in my mind, I think we both had in our mind, oh, we'll just create a page or so of information. But as we worked together, this thing just grew into something larger. And one of the reasons why it grew was that Veronica quite rightly and quite appropriately set up a situation whereby I was working with her stakeholders. So she had a big project at the time called Connecting Communities. And so she got members of that group to work with me and give me feedback. She got service users to give me feedback. And we also trialed the initial pilot stuff with some of her staff, and they gave me feedback. It was all of that feedback from the stakeholders themselves that really pushed Veronica and I to something bigger than we ever thought. That's why we ended up with toolkits. We ended up with a set of 3 toolkits, one for people with learning disabilities themselves, one for support workers, and one for their managers if those support workers were in an organisation. So the toolkits are a mixture of stories, if you like, case studies, and we link out to other internet resources. The way we structured the toolkits was to say, look, effective support requires you to have a set of beliefs, and it also requires you to know things. In this field, when we talk about digital exclusion, often the very first thing that people go to is we've got to train people, we've got to upskill them, as if that's the only thing we need to do. But my experience and other evidence in the inclusion field suggests that people's attitudes and beliefs are as important as their knowledge and skills. And in this field, it's attitudes and beliefs around rights, around what person-centred support is about, but also attitudes and beliefs around the role of technology and the potential of people. So a lot of people will shut down access to technology because they believe that people with learning disabilities are not interested or will never learn. And that's sometimes, not always, linked to the fact that they don't know how to do it. So they just assume that, well, somebody with a learning disability won't know how to do it. We can't possibly teach them. So there's all kinds of attitudes and beliefs that you kind of have to tackle. And that's what the toolkits does. It's not just pointing people to resources. It's not just helping them develop the skills and awareness. It's about really tapping into, look, you've got to change your belief set, your value set.
What are some of the things that we can be doing more of to sort of minimise digital exclusion? I mean, clearly it's got to do with knowledge and support people, whether that's parents, families. Well, you said it as well, attitude. That's really important.
My view is that there are 4 indicators of digital inclusion, exclusion that you need to address. You could call them 4 factors, 4 barriers, 4 enablers, but I call them access, use, empowerment, and participation. Lots of digital inclusion projects start with access, but don't go any further. So access is the typical thing that we'd all understand. You know, if you're going to support people to be digitally included, then they need access to technology. So sometimes that means that they need support to access funds so that they can buy the tablets, they can buy the data. Sometimes access can be facilitated through appropriate care plans or individual program plans. Sometimes parents and other support workers have guardianship over adults with young people with learning disabilities money. So it might be that it's just the person has the money, but they need their gatekeeper, their guardian, to help with the decision making around purchasing and getting access. Sometimes it's about architecture and design. So some of the parents I was talking to were telling me about the group homes and the care homes that their children were living in. And they were saying, look, the way my daughter's room is set up, she can't use her technology. There's nowhere to put it, or there's not a phone line to connect to the internet. And sometimes it's around the residential home have provided the internet, but it's only available in the shared living space, in the living room, and not in the person's private space. And so it's all those things around access. And sometimes it's about good transition practices, so often children will have good access to technology at school, but when they transition to college or to work or to another support service, all that goes, and it's almost like starting from scratch again. So that's access. You've got access to technology. Well, that doesn't mean you're going to use it. So then we have to think about use. And so there's the thing around supporting a person to gain the confidence. So we have to build confidence. We have to build digital competencies through training, education, etc. But use is also about supporting people to use technology in the ways they want to, not in the ways that other people expect them to. So if you're going to encourage somebody to use technology, they'll use it for something they want to use it for, not for something that somebody's told them they've got to use it for. So it's all about that person-centered support. Well, what do you want to use technology for? And not to be surprised when somebody says, I want to find a friend, or I want to go on a dating site, or I want a game. And the third indicator of digital inclusion, which I called empowerment, is really about having agency, being able to make your own decisions. So lots of adults with learning disabilities are blocked from making their own decisions. People decide for them, or just not supported to broaden their horizons because the people around them are not looking for all the possibilities. They're offered narrowed choices. So agency and decision making. And then linked to that participation, so the inclusion bit of digital inclusion, we're largely coming to understand is about being able to participate in all aspects of life. For all of us, we need technology to do that. So we need technology to learn, we need technology to work, we need technology to access healthcare, for leisure, for shopping, for finance, as well as finding love and communicating with friends and family. So digital inclusion will never happen 100% if we just stop at the access. We've got to think about the use, we've got to think about empowerment, and we've got to think about participation.
So that really kind of answers my question. I was going to ask you about what tips you could give, because that's kind of saying we need to make sure that we're doing those 4 things. I guess the thing that's going to come into it is that fear factor. But how do you think parents should deal with all that?
One of the big things I've argued for, I used to call it positive risk-taking, but that took on a different meaning and people understood it to mean safeguarding, which is not totally what I meant. So I've now called it possibility thinking. But it's essentially around balancing anybody, whether they're a parent, a sibling, or a support worker. I would encourage them to work with the person to balance the risks against the benefits. So talking and working with the person you're supporting to help them think through, well, if you do that, these are the risks. This is what you can do to mitigate the risks. Let's learn how to do it. But there's also an element of possibility thinking, which is around resilience. In the interviews I did, 1 or 2 parents were sharing with me how even though their children had had some bad experiences online, they were not advocating to prevent access ever again because they understood there was potential benefits. So there was resilience in them saying, look, we had a nasty experience. We don't ever want to go through that again, but this is what we can learn from it. Let's move on. And kind of believing that most of the people that we work with will recover with the right support. It doesn't have to be the end. But I think parents in particular can be role models, so all children look to their parents. And I think parents from quite a young age can be modelling and be open around the risks and talk through. So what research has shown is that when parents and support workers just shut down and say, look, you're not accessing the internet, it's not safe, the young person with a learning disability will circumvent them, go around them to get access to technology and do it secretly. So in that sense, it's much better to avoid that scenario because they're much more likely to get into trouble in a way and just work through with them. So if you've got those open relationships where you're happy for the person you're supporting to chat with you, then you're much more likely to be able to talk them through, that sounds like a risk, that doesn't. So I think there's being open, transparent, being a role model. I think there's a strong role for parents to be advocates for their children, to be asking those questions, when they're making decisions about where will their child go next. Ask those questions about what technology do you provide, what things do you put in place so that things are safe. Linked to being an advocate, parents, I've called it being a signpost. I'm sure there's a better word for it, but parents can be pointing their children and perhaps also the teachers and the others to, look, I found this really useful resource. And then finally, I think parents can help their children to self-advocate. And technology can actually be a really useful tool for self-advocacy. So with things like Zoom and PowerPoint, people with learning disabilities can be creating permanent records of their likes and dislikes and their support needs that parents can then say, look, Jane's created this little video about how she likes using technology. I think it is important to recognise that technology is with us and mostly it's beneficial. And as parents and as any support worker, I think we have a role to play and it would be worth us exploring that further.
Jane, thank you very much for your time.
You're welcome.
Thanks for listening. I hope, like me, you got a better understanding of why the right attitude towards digital inclusion is key and how it's not just about access, it's about use, empowerment and participation. In the next episode, the focus will be on design and software, and also on the topic that no series on technology can ignore, AI. If you enjoyed this episode, then please feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you'd like to get in contact with me, give me feedback or suggest guests for the podcast, then you can email me, Deborah@expandingworlds.com, or you can find me online at Deborah Caldo.